Buenas tardes, buenos días para los latinoamericanos en su mañana. Good afternoon, good morning for those in Latin America. I will briefly introduce not so much this webinar, but the whole webinar series of Obreal. I'm Ramon Torrent, president of Obreal. As many of you know, Obreal was an association created to implement an homonymous project from DG Relex and Europaid of the European Commission in 2004. After the initial project, it proved sustainable, as people say now. We continue to develop activities in Latin America with the main idea of building bridges in the twofold sense of being permanent, giving some infrastructure, and then also giving continent to Europe and Latin America. We had the honor of contributing to put together and to implement a project bringing together the European University Association and all association of universities in Latin America, mainly, I would say, led by ASCUN, the Asociación Colombiana de Universidades, and by the CIN, the Consejo Interuniversitario Nacional. Two representatives are there, very good friends from all times, so welcome. Then we continued to work with Latin America, and we had the honor also of having the German DAV, the German Exchange Academic Service, with us. So it makes sense that Ursula also participates in this first webinar. Then we enlarged the geographical scope of Obreal's work to the Arab countries, mainly to the Gulf countries, then to India, and then to Africa. And there again, we are leading the consortium for the implementation of one of the flagship projects in higher education of the European Union in Africa, also with the DAV in our partnership. Thanks again. Then this year, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Servicio Español para la Promoción de la Internacionalización de la Educación, SEPIE. This will prove very fruitful in the future, and this is why we'll try to organize one of our next webinars in close cooperation with them. We had envisaged for the month of May or June a meeting in Barcelona in order to advance in our initiative of South-South-North cooperation in higher education and related topics. I insist on related topics. We cannot put in isolation higher education. We have to take it together with research, innovation, social development, economic development, service to local territories. And this is an approach that we have been discussing mainly with our partners in Latin America. I have already mentioned ASCUN and CIN, but also AUGM from the very beginning. AUGM was led by the Universidad Federal de Rio Grande do Sur, and it continues to be one of the main players in AUGM. So this explains also the participation of Nicolas Maydard, and was discussed also with our partners in Africa. The meeting in Barcelona became impossible because of the COVID-19 crisis. So we thought that we had to replace the meeting in Barcelona by online meetings. I think it's important, and this will be my last words, that the COVID-19 crisis does not change the agenda that existed before for international cooperation. it can put some accent. We can draw lessons from this crisis, but the world does not begin or ends with COVID-19. On the contrary, we have to make the best use of the pandemic and the horror it has created, in particular in some individual people and families, to get a new impulse and a new drive for the cooperation that we were already carrying on. So again, this is the first seminar. We have new seminars ahead. The next one will be on the 3rd of June. Save the date, as people say. You'll receive more additional information after this one. We have to concretize still the agenda with some of our main partners, in this case also with the Spanish CEPIE, because I think they can bring a very important input to the webinar. That's all. So I have even spoken a couple of minutes more than I had envisaged, so that's more than enough for me. Elizabeth, go ahead, and Elizabeth will be the commander of the whole webinar. Ciao, bye-bye.
Thank you, Ramon. Lots of pressure. Thank you very much. I'm not just the moderator now, I'm apparently the commander. My primary duty in this webinar is to guide you through the interventions of our participants, and to do that in a way that is lively and interactive and interesting for you. We are all experimenting with webinar formats. I should say that this is a first one of this nature for Aubrial Global, like Ramon has said. We are very excited. We are doing this webinar with a number of our members, because we are indeed a membership institution, and also a number of our strategic partners in different regions. Ramon already mentioned several of those panelists. They will have a more proper introduction when we get to the next section of the webinar. I would also mention that we have one of our important members from Europe, the University of Bologna. Romina is here with us, in addition to the colleagues from Latin America and from Africa that Ramon has already named. So we're very pleased. Again, this is the first of several. We decided to take a topic today that was of significance across the globe, not just because there's a trend towards regional integration projects, particularly in the higher education sector, but also because mobility, which is the heart of this webinar, is a topic that is now put into question to a large extent. We are doing webinars. Many of the students who are studying abroad had to return to their home countries. There is question as to whether or not our universities will even operate physically at full capacity in the next semester of this year. So obviously for all of us working in international collaboration in the higher education and international mobility, international research mobility, we have a lot of questions. So in the background of this webinar is also the issue, of course, of COVID and how it impacts our international collaboration. In the forefront of this webinar is the question of mobility and the role it can and is and potentially should play in regional integration and regional development. We are taking this topic from the perspective of 3 different regions in the world, potentially 4 different regions if you look at the different sub-regions of Africa, and we have 2 different sub-regions of Africa represented today on this panel. And we will have a look at organizations, but also institutions that have a particular ambition to foster regional integration and the role that mobility is playing in that. Naturally, we'll look at Europe, where this has been a project for over 2 decades. But we will also look at how this manifests itself in Latin America, the role of regional associations in generating regional mobility, and how this is developing now in Africa, both in Southern Africa and in Eastern Africa, through the eyes of 2 regional university associations. So that's what's in store. Before we get started, we wanted to have a quick poll of the audience. We know that you are joining us from many parts of the world. We want to know from where and we want you to get a sense of who's with you today on this webinar. So I would ask my colleague Nicolas, who's in the background now, to put up the first poll. Please indicate for us which region you are from. So we have there Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, Northern Africa. You see we've divided Africa down into different regions. I believe Central Africa is missing, but we apologize for that. Europe, South America, Central America, North America, the Caribbean, or Asia. That's poll number 1. Poll number 2, once you finish that, is about the topic. Do you believe that physical mobility, physical in parentheses, in the higher education sector should be promoted strategically within regions? So what we call intra-regional mobility. And do you believe that this is a means to enhance regional development? You have some choices there. Yes, we must do this. Absolutely. No. Yes, but this is less important than promoting with mobility with other competitive universities and regions. And finally, yes, but this is not very feasible. I know we limit your choices, though this is difficult. Okay, we see the answers coming in. We'll give you about another 30 seconds or so to do that. Okay, we see here a strong South American participation. Great. Some joining us from North America as well. Excellent. Okay, just a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll. Looks like almost 75% of you have voted. Keep coming. Okay, so it looks as though our strongest participation, almost 50% of those who voted, is coming from South America. Excellent. Secondarily from Europe, a bit over 25%. Southern Africa, almost 10%. Very welcome. A little bit from Central America, 5%. Smaller participation from the Caribbean and Asia. Asia we understand because unfortunately we haven't included your perspective on this panel, though obviously regional integration initiatives are very prominent in Southeast Asia in particular, so that will be a topic for another day. And like I said before, we're very happy to see some North American colleagues joining us as well. If we look at the second question, very good. 73% of you who voted said, yes, we must do this. We must promote physical mobility as a vehicle for regional integration and development. But nonetheless, 15% of you said, yes, but we should not do this instead of, or it's less important than promoting mobility with other competitive universities and regions. And I think that is a constant tension we sometimes hear, particularly in parts of the world, for example, like in South America, where if you're mobile within your region, you're not necessarily mobile for linguistic purposes. So you're going to study or research in another country, perhaps a neighboring country in your region, but you're not getting the same, necessarily the same advantage in learning another language, if it may be. So, and there are many motives, but that's interesting. 12% of you said yes, that this is important but not feasible. And I think that's an interesting point that we should explore in more depth, what the obstacles are to promoting regional mobility. Okay, so let's move on to our panelists. I think I've spoken enough. We have sort of two main blocks in this webinar. The first block is basically an introductory section where I'm going to let each panelist make a first very brief presentation of less than 5 minutes. We've allowed each of the panelists one slide and one slide only. The purpose of that was to give you an illustration of who they are. So what is their organization? What are their objectives as an organization? But also to explain to you the role that they play in regional integration in higher education in their respective regions, and the extent to which they're promoting this, financing this, or fostering this. The one slide is also intended because we realize that there might be some difficulties with the English. We are doing this webinar in English by default. Future webinars, we would like to offer a translation service. We understand we all have different accents in English, and that is part of the beauty of working globally and multilaterally, regionally. So we ask panelists to speak slowly and clearly, and they have their one slide as a backdrop. From that, we will move on to a set of questions to different panelists based to some extent on the nature of their organizations and what they're doing, and also the challenges and initiatives that they would like to share with you today. I would like to start now. We're going to move to Africa first for our first set of presentations. Keep in mind that as we go, you can ask questions. We will not address them during the presentations, but we will have a section at the end of the webinar where we will try to group some of the questions from the Q&A and have the panelists answer those. So feel free to write questions as we go. We have colleagues taking note of those questions, and we will try to pick them up later. Once again, I should say that write your questions in the Q&A function application and not in the chat. The chat has been disabled. So moving to Africa, I would like to ask our first speaker to explain to us a bit more about Eastern Africa and the role that the Inter-University Council for East Africa plays. I'm very pleased today to welcome the Executive Secretary of the IUCEA, the Inter-University Council for East Africa, Professor Alexandre Liambambaje. This association is a strategic partner in the context of the HAQUA initiative, which is the large contract that Ramon Torrent referred to earlier that Obrial Global is leading regarding harmonization in higher education in Africa. We are very pleased to have Alexandre with us today and welcome him now for our first introduction. Thank you, Alexandre.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good evening. I'd like first to thank Obrial Global for inviting me to this webinar. I hope the voice is coming through. As Elizabeth introduced me, I'm called Alexandre Liambambaje. I am Executive Secretary of Inter-University Council for East Africa, which is an institution of East African community with headquarters in Kampala, Uganda. East African community is composed by 6 partner states, and we have 130 member universities. The mandate, as you can see on the slide, Inter-University Council for East Africa is mandated to advise East African community partner states in all matters related to higher education. And in 2017, East African community was declared a common higher education area with IUCEA being the leading organization for the operationalization of the common higher education area under the guidance and supervision of the Council of Ministers from all partner states. Common higher education area in East Africa implies free movement of labor, mutual recognition of qualifications, and enhancement of mobility of students and faculty in the region. In order to achieve its mandate and the objectives of the organization, the institution has got four main important departments. The first one, in fact, is responsible for exchange, linkages, and partnerships. And it is responsible for networking of universities within the region and networking with universities outside the region. It is also the department responsible for staff and student mobility in East African community. The second department, very important, is responsible for research and innovation. And we work on the improvement of research management, on improvement of quality of collaborative research, and also we work on the promotion of research and innovation in the region. The third department is responsible for quality assurance and qualification frameworks, and it contributes to enhancement of quality of teaching, research, and innovation in collaboration with all member universities. And the last one is an ICT department, which facilitates universities network and also provide online support for all our member universities. Coming back to mobility, Inter-University Council for East Africa supports staff mobility among member universities for teaching, research, external examination, and curriculum review. We also support students to access postgraduate studies in countries outside the country of origin by providing scholarships for master's degree. For instance, this year, more than 120 students got scholarships from that scheme. And also, we facilitate mobility of students between Africa or East Africa and South Korea for students who go there for undergraduate studies. And lastly, we are going to start mobility between China and East African community to train teachers for technical and vocational education. We have also the mandate, and we deliver on it, to develop regional policies and instruments such as East Africa Qualification Framework for Higher Education, Student Mobility Policy, and also we developed a software for the calculation of student unit cost, because all countries in East African community are requested to offer the same treatment to all students coming from the region as what is offered to national students. Specific interventions I would like to mention is, once again, financial support to staff, academic staff. On a yearly basis, we facilitate 60 staff to move across the community for the activities I mentioned above. We provide scholarships to students for postgraduate and undergraduate studies. And we have also interventions that are oriented toward bringing together our leaders of universities through what we call East African Qualification Quality Assurance Forum, through our annual meeting where we invite all vice chancellors, and also we have Science, Technology and Innovation Conference, which takes place every 2 years. So in conclusion, I would like to mention that for us, regional mobility and international mobility is very important to bring together researchers, to promote collaborative research, but also to learn better how we can work together as a scientific community. So we strongly believe that responses to pandemic like COVID-19 will come from higher education and research institutions. And we don't believe that working in isolation will give us results. Reason why we believe that we have to keep promoting staff and student mobility so that we could address in an effective way and altogether pandemics that are likely to happen in the future. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Excellent, well done. You packed a lot into a very short amount of time. For those who don't know your organization, and I imagine many do not, I think this was an excellent introduction. It also shows how ambitious you are in East Africa. I remind participants from Latin America and other parts of the world that the East African community is an economic community in Africa. And it is actually the only community that has declared a higher education area in Africa, which is quite interesting. So Alexandre's organization, the IUCEA, is really at the forefront of that. There's a lot of issues that you raised that I would like to come back to in the next set of questions, particularly regarding your collaboration globally. You mentioned China and Korea, but also regarding the work that you do in different frameworks like quality assurance and qualifications and things like this, which is very much linked to mobility in the region. I would like to move now to Southern Africa, so to the SADC region. We're very pleased to have Nicolas Joest here from the Southern African Regional Universities Association, SARUA, in many ways a counterpart to the IUCEA, a university association representing very diverse countries in the SADC, Southern African region. Nico is a senior advisor and internationalization specialist and an advocate of multilateral global cooperation, and we're very pleased he's with us. So Nico, please.
Sorry, there we are. Now, I think my voice was gone. But thank you very much for having me on the panel. It is for SARUA a privilege to be part of this discussion. As you know, we've had numerous discussions around collaboration interregionally, not in intra-Africa, but I think regional collaboration is the future collaboration in the world that we're moving into. But to come first to SARUA, it's a member-based organization, as on the slide. We represent the 16 nation states in the SADC organization. Interestingly, it's very diverse, like all regional organizations. We have Portuguese, French, and then, of course, English speaking countries. 4 of the nation states are island states, which brings a different dimension to the diversity of SARUA and of SADC, as I said before. One of the cornerstones for higher education collaboration within SADC and SARUA is the SADC protocol that was promulgated in 2000. And all the nation states accepted the SADC protocol. One of the issues that was highlighted in the protocol was interstate mobility. And to promote interstate mobility, the protocol stated, and all countries agreed, that students move and pay fees as if they are local. So there are no international fees charged to any of the students that move within SADC. The interesting issue about the whole mobility issue is that inter-regional mobility of students is about at 3% of the total student body. although SADC's protocol determined that universities must reserve 5% of their student places for students from SADC. So there is a mechanism for the intra-regional mobility to take place. It is not equal at the moment. South Africa receives about 45,000 students from the rest of SADC. And there's not that many other SADC students moving around to the different SADC countries, but it has to do with capacity. Then the other issue that I just want to highlight is that SARUA is a organization that, because of the diversity and the vastness of Southern Africa, it's mainly driven as a regional hub that uses digital technology to communicate and connect, and therefore the SARUA activities are much more digital than real mobility, which also assist us now with the current provisions that you can't move across borders within the SADC region. SARUA have a whole set of goals that would promote inter-regional collaboration, and they are linked to research, teaching, and engagement. And in the next session, I will talk a little bit about some of those projects that we are engaged in. But the bottom line about SARUA is that it is a member organization, and it's driven by the goal of regional integration. And as you know, there is the quality assurance project that you spoke about earlier that would focus on the inter-regional quality assurance and exchange of credit and program accreditation. It is still in its baby shoes. I believe there's a long way to go. It isn't easy in a diverse environment where, because of the colonial heritage, you actually are having 3 different systems within the SADC region, and within SARUA you have a French system. For the French-speaking countries, you've got the Portuguese based higher education system, and then of course the the British system, where the British colonies actually inherited a lot of their higher education background from that. And to integrate that into one has been a long process, and I still believe it is going to be difficult, but that is the critical role that SARUA plays in bringing these diverse people together and provide them with a platform to actually see a single higher education space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico. Well done in respecting the time. Nice introduction to SARUA. You've already pointed to some of the challenges you face. I think some of those challenges will be echoed in the Latin American region when we come to it. But before we do that, I would like to turn now to Europe. Europe squares a little bit this circle, offering a long experience in regional integration via the European higher education area, offering its own particular successes and challenges. We've chosen today to involve both a highly active university in this field, but also an organization that not only has contributed to mobility and consolidation of the European higher education area within Europe, but also has been extremely active globally. Pretty much all of you would know the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service. We're very happy to have with us here today Ursula Pentner. She is the head of division for development cooperation and transnational programs very familiar with some of the challenges and opportunities posed by regions in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia. And we would like to hear from her first, and then we'll turn to Italy and to Bologna to have an institutional perspective on this topic. Please do respect the time if you can. I will shout if we go over too much. Ursula, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to be here on this panel and to be able to meet people from different countries and different continents in this very intimate atmosphere of this webinar. This is really a great experience. Thank you. We'll try to respect the time. I think it's not so difficult because, as you said, Elizabeth, the DAD might be well known as a German institution supporting internationalization and mobility. We are an old institution. We are heading, we're heading toward our 100th birthday because the DAD was founded in 1925, and we are a membership institution. Our members are 241 German universities and 104 organized student bodies. So we are not a governmental organization, and this is important because our main purpose is to foster the internationalization of the German universities in terms of individual mobility and in terms of project funding between German universities and universities abroad in all the regions of this world. We are funded mainly by 3 German ministries, as you can see at the left-hand side of my slide, which is the Federal Foreign Office, AA, which is our institutional funding ministry, the Ministry for Education and Research, and about 10% of a yearly budget come from the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. But we are also the national agency for the EU Erasmus program in higher education. So the EU is the 4th important donor for the DAD. We have been supporting student mobility since 1925, and so we have quite impressive numbers. We have been supporting around about 2.5 million people since 1950. In 2018, just to give you an idea, we had 145,000 people funded, among them 50,000 roundabout via EU mobility. So the intra-regional EU mobility makes about 1/3 of our total numbers. But we do not only, and I think perhaps in this context, we're not only known for funding mobility and partnerships, but also for the DS program, which we included in the slide at the bottom, at the right-hand side. The DS program was put into action together with the Rectors Conference with the idea to share a European perspective on internationalization, on higher education, and on regional integration in higher education with partners from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. So to learn together about higher education and about how it could work. Through training courses, through partnerships between higher education institutions, through dialogue like seminars and things, and through projects, in-depth cooperation with regional partners, like for instance the HKA project that has been mentioned, or like the Caminos project focusing on regional mobility inside Latin America. So this is a very brief introduction to what we are and what we do. Since we are based on physical, real mobility, COVID-19 is a real challenge to us. And I'm very glad to be here and to be able to discuss with you what alternatives or what additions to physical mobility we can foresee for the future to give us like a sort of second leg to stand on in these difficult times. Thanks a lot.
Okay, excellent, Ursula. Thank you very much. We look forward to coming back to that in the dialogue. Thank you as well for mentioning the project Caminos. This was a project that Obrial had the pleasure of leading in cooperation with partners in 5 different Latin American countries. Several of them are represented here today in the panel and or in the audience. Hello to everyone. DAD was a partner on this project, as was the University of Bologna, which is also with us today on the panel. A warm welcome to Romina Chinis, who joins us from the international office. Romina obviously has a perspective on Bologna's regional mobility within Europe, as this institution has been extremely active over the past decades on the European scale, but also has a perspective on Latin American mobility, which is why we invited her to join us today. So Romina, please.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for having me. And I must say hello to all the Caminos partners that are joining us today. As you can see on the slide, I would like to talk about the international dimension at MAT institution and the role it's played in regional integration. When the policy is concerned the internationalization of the University of Bologna, it follows a scheme of delegation we have established at institutional level and also at departmental level. So when we talk about institutional level, we have the rector, the vice rectors, but when it comes to internationalization, we have the vice rector of international relations, and also we have delegates for geographical areas. At departmental level, we also have delegates for internationalization that interact with the deans. Below that scheme, as you can see, we have the International Relations Division, the area where I work, and we are divided also in geographical areas that we work jointly with the vice rector, the delegate, and also the delegate for internalization at departmental level. So as an IRO, we try to combine the strategy of the University of Bologna institutional level with the needs of our academic community and work jointly taking into account the international dimension. But however, to do that, we had to take into account the Erasmus Charter for Higher Education that had set 6 objectives for the universities. The first one is the mobility, promoting mobility at all levels, with that means students, staff, and administrative. The second objective is international skills for graduates. And the third one are international programs, that mean international programs that can be taught in English, double, joint, multiple degrees, or summer schools. Then we have multilateral projects like capacity building or intersectoral cooperation. And then we have making the so-called knowledge triangle work, that means research, education, and on innovation. And the last one, I think that is really important for this webinar, is improving the knowledge and cooperation on extra-European context. So how does the University of Bologna pursue these objectives of the Erasmus Charter and the impact that has in the international dimension? We do that, and the way to translate it is to have these areas of intervention that you can see on the slide. We have the academic offer, we have the student and academic community, we have the students and staff profile, and finally the cooperation for development. But when it regards to academic offer, we have international degrees. For example, in Latin America, we have different double degrees. We have 3 in Argentina and 1 in Colombia. And also we have an international program that's released a multiple degree with the University of Dakar in Senegal. When it comes to explain the student and academic community, we do that through international recruitment of students that meet degree-seeking students or international professors. Well, we also do mobility with the visiting professor schemes, incoming staff or incoming professor, and we do that with the Erasmus Plus program, the International Credit Mobility that you already know, the Key Action 107. For example, we use that a lot, the scheme of the 107 International Credit Mobility with Africa. For example, last year we win with South Africa, Senegal, and Ghana. And this year, the 2020, we apply for Senegal, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and South Africa. For us in Italy, it's not so easy to use it for Latin America because the budget is really low. So instead of using that, we promote the visiting scheme through our frame of bilateral agreements. Regarding the students and staff profile, that means the outgoing mobility schemes that are funded by the University of Bologna for exchange periods outside Europe. We have a program that is called Overseas. We have 300 places, and more than 100 places are from Latin America and Africa. We have a lot of partners in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and also in South Africa and also in Africa. So we use this channel as a cooperation with our partners. At least the last one, the cooperation for development, here's how we have the international projects. So we have the capacity project, as you mentioned, with Latin America, we had Caminos. Now we have also Vita Global, that's a multilateral project also coordinated by Oberal, where we have South Africa and also Latin America. We also have an intra-Africa coordinated by Botswana with partners from South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. We also have all other funds and donors. We have financial funds from the International National Agency for Cooperation for Development that focus, this is an Italian one, that focus in Ethiopia and Senegal. And the last one, we had funds from the University of Bologna that with partners, with ongoing partners with bilateral and specific agreement that we use also to promote our cooperation with Latin America and South Africa. So the idea was only to give you an overview on how the international strategy of the University of Bologna interact with the regional dimension. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Romina. Excellent. And again, I think it's really interesting to get an institutional perspective on this topic, because at the end of the day, we need to see the machinery of a university, how it thinks strategically about mobility, how mobility actions relate to international partnerships and agreements, relate to projects. And thank you, Romina, for mentioning some of the projects that you undertake, particularly in cooperation for development. One experience we have as Obrial is that you can't just segment mobility from international cooperation projects. They're very complementary. One should feed the other. And I think that was something that Caminos did very well. Caminos did not fund mobility, but Caminos was about how do we manage and how do we promote mobility in a region. And this obviously had to be taken in conjunction with funding schemes for mobility, but which was not part of the program itself. So thank you for that, Romina. I would like to now jump across the ocean to Latin America. We have two associations represented on this panel. The National Council for Universities in Argentina, the CIN, and the Colombian University Association, EJCUN. We've grouped together Julio Taylor and Luisa Villamizar to do a sort of duo collaborative performance for you, showing, of course, how much they work together as associations in the Latin American region. They're going to be speaking specifically about the work they do collaboratively as associations for mobility between Latin American countries. And we'll finish with another institutional perspective, but once again, an institution that's very much engaged in the region, the Mercosur region, with Nicolas Maillard. I would like to invite first now Julio and Luisa. I believe that Luisa will be speaking in English. Julio might have some comments in Spanish, which I will then translate. So welcome to you both.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning from Colombia. And many thanks to our colleagues in Oreal for inviting us. Today, I will talk on behalf of our peer associations about the Latin American Exchange Program, PILA. PILA is an intra-regional program of academic mobility among 3 associations from Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico. The National Interuniversity Council, CIN, the National Association of Universities and Higher Education Institutions and UIES in Mexico, and the Colombian Association of Universities, ASCUN. The association that represents the largest number of institutions, public institutions in Argentina, and public and private in Colombia and Mexico. All we are part of the Latin American and the Caribbean area of higher education enlaces. And about the PILA, the program has a background since 2013 with bilateral programs as HIMA, MACA or MACMEX, with the same association. So in the second semester of 2018, began the first mobility as PILA, as a trilateral program. And we had a pilot in Caminos project where we work at a quality level in the program. Nowadays, 67 higher education institutions participate from Colombia, over 88 higher education institutions associated in ASCUN, 34 over 66 in Argentina, and 46 over 197 in Mexico. Since 2013 until 2019, we have mobilized approximately 3,000 students, and currently in PILA we have included staff, academic, and researchers mobility. And the spirit in this program is about reciprocity, self-financing by host universities with scholarships of accommodation, food, and recognition of studies is the main purpose. And one of the purpose is to have our Erasmus in Latin America and the Caribbean, and to open the possibility to integrate more countries. And maybe the next possible partners are Chile and Brazil. And as you can see in the slide, we have 4 points that we will be developed in the next step on the panel. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luisa. Julio, would you like to add something?
Buenas tardes a todos. Pido mil disculpas por no poder expresarme en inglés y le pido a Elizabeth que me ayude a la traducción. Solamente agrego que en América Latina y el Caribe, desde hace 12 años exactamente, desde la Conferencia Regional de Educación Superior celebrada en Colombia, se está intentando avanzar en un proceso de cooperación e integración regional a nivel de educación superior.
Julio would like to add, first of all, he wishes everyone a very good day. He's sorry that he can't intervene in English. He would like to add that something that's very important with Latin America and the Caribbean is that since 12 years ago, when the first regional conference for higher education took place, the CRES in Colombia, there has been an ongoing integration process in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Debemos reconocer que los avances hasta el momento no han sido significativos y la movilidad académica de estudiantes y profesores estuvo como objetivo desde un comienzo de esta iniciativa. Y es por eso que a nuestro juicio el programa PILA, que nació bilateralmente entre los 3 países y luego se transformó en un programa trilateral, es una apuesta a consolidar este proceso de integración, porque es muy probable que en el corto y sobre todo en el mediano plazo, este programa que hoy es trilateral pase a ser un programa continental.
So he would like to say that the process of integration in the higher education sector in Latin America has been slow. It's ambitious, but at times slow. There have been some small steps. Mobility has been an objective since the start. And from this perspective, the consolidation of the PILA program was a big step. Even though there aren't large numbers of mobile students, the fact that this is a trilateral program involving 3 important countries is very considerable. And the intention in the immediate future is that this program will grow to incorporate the whole continent, to incorporate other associations from other countries in the continent.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Julio. We will definitely come back to that. As you can already see, Latin America has its own process, its own integration process, which is with its own dynamic and its own history. And it's very much building that process at a much different speed and with a different dynamic than perhaps we are in other parts of the world. So it's important to look at those differences. Finally, I would like to ask Nicolas Mayer, who joins us from Brazil, and is not only representing an important federal university in Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, but is also representing an organization, an important regional integration organization in the Mercosur region called the Grupo Montevideo University Association, which I think he will speak about, which has a considerable now experience with regional mobility within Mercosur. So Nicolas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation and the kind words. I wanted to bring in, just like Romina did, some idea from the point of view of a university first. So as you can see on the slide, UFRGS, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, is at the heart of the south of Southern America, of Mercosur. We are a large-scale university, one of the biggest of Brazil, one of the biggest in the region. We have been part of an important part of the regional conference on higher education that Julio Tyler just mentioned, which was held in 2018 in Cordoba. It was a big event, and the key point that has been discussed by all the 12,000 people who gathered there was regional integrations. How could higher education in Latin America contribute to regional integration? So I'd say that this notion of regional integration is in the DNA of most universities in Latin America, and certainly of my university, UFRGS. For the same reason, we are also part of AUREM, as Elizabeth mentioned, and Ramon Torrent at the beginning of this webinar. AUREM today gathers more than 40 public universities of 5 different countries: Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, and Bolivia. So it's 6, actually, not 5. And it's very active, again, for regional integration through a series of programs, starting with student mobility. So I wanted also in this slide to give an idea of what student mobility means for a university like mine. It's interesting for me to see that Romina has followed the same path and gave some numbers, and you can compare the figures I provide for my university with those of a large-scale university like Unibo in Italy. So typically for my university in 2018, at undergraduate level, mobility students, so mobility, not degree-seeking students, it meant 338 students studying at UFRGS, and it meant sending 152 students to the world. Of the incoming students, 46%, almost half of them, came from Latin America, mostly Colombia, Argentina, Peru, and Bolivia. And 20% of the outgoing students went to Latin America. So in a country like Brazil, in my university, we definitely receive far more Latin American students that we do send our Brazilian students to neighboring countries. Regarding Latin America, we participate mostly to 2 programs, the program Escala from AUREM, and another which is important, which I wanted to mention, which is called Marca. In Escala through AUREM, we roughly exchange 20 students per year, to give you an idea. Through Marca, it's roughly 10 students per year. And I just want to mention Marca because it's complementary to the PILA program, which has been just introduced by Julio and Luisa. Marca is an old program by Eurostandard. It started in the 2000s, sorry. It's based on degree accreditation. So we mutually recognize our degrees, and then we have a funding program to exchange students. Marca, on the whole, since it started in 26, from 26 to 2017, has meant roughly 2,377 places. So almost 2,400 in 12 years. You can compare this to Erasmus to have an idea. As Luisa mentioned, we are trying to build something like Erasmus in Latin America. While Marca, this old program with its 2,377 places, it's roughly, if you compare to an average year in Europe, it's roughly 600 times smaller than what happens in an average Erasmus year in Europe. So it's way, 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 way smaller than what European can do. I think I'm almost done with my time. I just wanted to give a final word. The goal of mobility for my university in Latin America is definitely to promote a sense of Latin American citizenship. It's really regional integration. It's really a way to promote to young Brazilians, to provide to young Brazilians an idea of what's going on in a neighboring country, which share a common culture, which is of course critical to build citizenship. That's what I wanted to say for an introduction.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicolas. And thank you as well for giving us a sense of scale. I think in the next block of questions, we're going to look at some of the challenges, but also how to weight regional mobility potentially in the context of other types of international mobility. It is not the only type of mobility that's desirable or needed, but we do think it should have an important role, as you've just said. But you're right. I think, you know, if you look at the numbers in Latin America on the PILA program, on the Grupo Montevideo programs, they are considerably less compared to other large mobility schemes that might be for a number of reasons, not just financial. And I would like to turn to that now in the next block of questions. How we're going to do the next block of questions is that we're going to have questions to specific panelists. I would ask you to be brief, to keep your response to three minutes if possible. You're not obliged to respond, but we want to give different panelists the opportunity to weigh in on different parts of this debate. I think this first set of presentations gave us now the overall picture. We learned about some organizations and what their objectives are. We learned about some current mobility programs and what their objectives are. And we also learned about some institutions and what their objectives are and how they're managing their own mobility. I think now we want to look at, okay, so what are the incentives for mobility? What are the obstacles, and what can we do to promote it better, to make it more of a reality? Because in many regions, particularly in Africa and Latin America, mobility, intra-regional mobility, is still limited despite the political and institutional ambitions in this field. I would like to turn first to Africa, and I would like to ask Alexandre and Nico, what are the current incentives for mobility within the African region, either within East Africa or Southern or within Africa in general? Are there incentives? Is it feasible? Is it promoted by institutions and organizations? And how can this be improved and enhanced? You can reflect to some extent on the obstacles, but it would be helpful if you also told us a little bit about the opportunities. And also why you think it's so important to have regional mobility for regional development and the generation of African knowledge. So I would like to first offer the floor to Alexandre and then Nico.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Inter-University Council for East Africa offers quite a number of incentives. First, it was through the creation of regional institutions. Partner states borrowed a lot of money from international organizations like the World Bank and African Development Bank to establish African Centers of Excellence for postgraduate studies in the region, and established 24 regional centers of excellence, and established also 4 regional incubation centers. There are also incentives to establish regional research center, like one established in mathematics with regional universities, and also the promulgation, the development and the promulgation of regional policies that support regional integration and regional mobility. Lastly, partner states avail money to Inter-University Council for East Africa through its budget to facilitate professors, lecturers, and researchers to move across the region or offer scholarships to students. The challenges, I could see that one of the main challenge is South-South collaboration, which is not yet well established. We still favor South-North collaboration for different reasons, and we are working on it through our forums, bringing together universities to know each other, to share more information about ongoing research activities and areas of possible collaborations among our universities.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alexandre, for elaborating that. I mean, there's obviously a lot of movement. It's true that the recent developments regarding the establishment of regional centers of excellence that are predicated on intra-African mobility, but also on intra-African knowledge generation, are particularly interesting. I would encourage colleagues to check that out. We can share some resources and some links after this meeting for those who might be further interested in those initiatives. Nico, how do you see this from the perspective of Southern Africa? What are some of the incentives? What are some of the challenges? And what is Sarua doing?
From the Sarua point of view, we don't have an organized regional collaboration like the East Africans have. But as I said in the beginning, the SADC protocol can be seen as an incentive where there is clearly an agreement between the states, the SADC states, to reserve 5% of their places for regional mobility of students. Of course, that's not government driven, that's more individual needs driven, and therefore you will see that students that have specific needs go and study elsewhere. There were a few nationally funded programs. The one that springs to mind was the Zimbabwe Presidential Scholarship Program that funded quite a number of Zimbabwean students studying in South Africa. And so did the Botswana government in the early 2000s to about 2007-8, also funded probably about 15 to 20,000 Botswana students coming to South Africa. So those were the early mobilities, and it was needs driven. South Africa had the capacity to absorb more of the Southern African students, while there wasn't capacity in the other countries for all the, not only the students, but for specific programs. But then there are a number of initiatives that I would call ad hoc, and they actually make sense and have a lot of impact. One of the ad hoc would be those that are funded by external funders, normally based in the north, but are funding students to study within Southern Africa. We are, and from Africa. A number of universities, I don't want to name them, but I can. In South Africa, it's mainly Cape Town and Stellenbosch and Pretoria that receive large funding from the Mastercard Foundation and others to bring African students into Southern Africa for mainly for PhD programs and capacity building. The biggest obstacle as far to intra-regional collaboration and mobility is that I do think that we focus mainly on formal qualification mobility. That means a student or a person moves for a full qualification. And the type of mobility that you see in Europe, where it's semester-based or even shorter, that isn't there yet. And I think for a better understanding of Africans for them within the African region, Southern Africa and Eastern Africa could easily do that. We probably need funding from the governments to do that. SADC have not received any funding, the SARUA, from the Southern African governments to do that. I believe, and I know we're going to discuss it a bit later, I believe that intra-regional mobility in the next 3-4 years will probably become the mobility driver because of the new world we're looking at. So just in conclusion, there is a lot of mobility. Most of it is actually needs driven by students looking for places to study, and it is not mobility to really promote intra-regional collaboration that much. There are a lot of research collaborations, as I said earlier. The Centers of Excellence, I was not going to speak about them. There are a number of those initiatives. The one last initiative that I want to just mention is the Pan-African University that's just been created by the African Union, and they have just announced some of the institutions throughout Africa that will host special programs, and I hope that that would see inter-Africa mobility too.
Okay, thank you, Nico. A very important reflection, I think, the extent to which intra-African mobility might take place somewhat organically in certain regions. Obviously, South Africa has a higher capacity in the SADC region to absorb international students, and to some extent has an interest or has had an interest to do that, versus mobility that is promoted and financed and motivated by a higher regional integration, regional development objective, which, if I've understood you correctly, you're saying would need political support. Yeah. Not just political endorsement, because SADC has theoretically politically endorsed that, but it needs some regional financing as well.
Yes, that's correct.
And I think that's a challenge that our colleagues in Latin America also feel and have experienced. I would now turn over to Luisa and to Julio. It is true that the PILA program is interesting because this program has been a bottom-up program. This has been a program that governments have not created, nor have governments financed. Similar for the programs of the Mercosur region, which are part of the Grupo Montevideo group of universities. So you could say that these programs are very much driven by the universities and their own interests and their own commitments, and the associations and their interests and their commitments, not necessarily with the top-down political investment that they might require to be scaled up. I would like to ask Julio and Luisa what they think about that, what they think the current incentives are in Latin America to study in or to research in another Latin American country, to be mobile within Latin America, where they think there are still the greatest challenges, and where they think there might also be opportunities in scaling up that mobility. So I turn that to Luisa and Julio. I don't know who would like to speak first. Julio, we can continue to translate if needed.
Okay. Well, in general, universities must finance their academic mobility in Latin America. There are a few programs that have external or government funding, And the promotion is done between networks and associations or through interinstitutional agreements. So academic mobility is one of the first ways of internationalization, and in a numerical level has an impact or indicators. However, academic mobility in Latin America is still very low and very difficult when you only have the resources of the universities. So that few students can do mobility. It's only maybe, I don't know, 1%. And there are programs such as AUGM, Scale, PAME of UDUAL, Pacific Alliance, Educational Mercosur, among others. And in this case, the PILA program represents an opportunity for an exchange due to support scholarships for students or academic or staff. There is a great interest of universities in academic and traditional mobility. Therefore, collective work works, but the challenge is to cover other needs such as financial quality assurance and to strengthen types of cooperations with other countries in the region, in that case, Latin American and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luisa. Yes, so Luisa pointed to the fact that indeed one of the more sustainable elements of programs like PILA is that it is about self-financing and reciprocity between the universities. One of the challenges is that it doesn't receive the external funding or political support that it would need to truly upscale, like we've seen potentially in the European Union with Erasmus and with the European Union's investments in mobility. Julio, would you like to complement that?
Solamente partir de la base de que en América Latina, en general, no es en todo el continente, pero en buena parte del continente, la educación superior es gratuita, porque tiene un objetivo de igualar posibilidades y de ascenso social de la población. Y en ese marco, la movilidad internacional requiere de financiamiento externo al propio estudiante. Y es por eso que prácticamente todos los programas que Luisa nombró se basan justamente en un apoyo económico que en general no conseguimos de los gobiernos, y es por eso que las instituciones tienen que afectar recursos para subsidiarnos. Y el desafío ahora es que probablemente uno de los resultados concretos del COVID-19 sea un futuro de estrechez presupuestaria muy grande, y veremos cómo los programas de movilidad se van a resentir en ese aspecto, ¿no?
Okay, thank you, Julio. So Julio pointed to the fact that in Latin America, at least in public education, which is an extremely dominant sector in Latin America, higher education is primarily free. This is, for example, true in Argentina. The universities have a high degree of autonomy. And in this respect, given the high level of public basic financing of the higher education sector, there hasn't been extra financing that's been allocated towards mobility on top of some of the core financing of public higher education. This poses a challenge if one wants to upscale mobility for public objectives or for regional integration objectives, because the financing on the public level simply isn't there. You've heard Luisa mention some external partners and donors and organizations that have funded mobility within the region. But again, like in Africa, this is limited to the role of external partners and donors. Julio also mentioned that with COVID-19, this will be a challenge in the future because we anticipate that public financing will be constrained. So making the case for physical mobility and the financing of it will be all the more difficult. We will come back to COVID and also some prospects for potentially what is called virtual mobility later in the webinar. But I think that's a very important point. I wanted to, before we go on to Nicolas Maillard, I wanted to mention a question or a comment that came in the questions section from one of our colleagues working for the European Commission, for the Executive Agency for Education, Audiovisual and Culture, which is managing many of the collaboration programs between the EU and the rest of the world in higher education, including mobility programs. And attention was drawn to a program that the European Commission finances in Africa and in ACP countries. ACP are African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, an intra-ACP mobility program, and now what is an intra-Africa mobility program. So the European Commission is, I think, a unique international partner in that sense, in that it is financing cooperation for regional integration and development. And it does that also through mobility. There is an existing program in Africa that is supporting intra-African mobility. This has also been financed in Latin America in the past, in Southeast Asia. The program we mentioned earlier, called the HAQUA, the Harmonization of Quality Assurance and Accreditation Initiative in Africa, is also the EU's contribution to supporting regional harmonization in the African continent. So I think in that respect, the EU is a quite interesting and unique donor and partner, because it does take an interest in supporting these regional integration initiatives. That being said, I think Julio's point is very relevant, as well as Nico Justa's point, that up until now, governments in your own respective regions haven't really taken the lead in financing intra-regional mobility. This might be slightly different in East Africa, where there seems to be a higher political investment in the university sector and in regional integration. I would like to come back to Nicolas Maillard with a specific question to you. You've shown us already how active you are in regional mobility in Latin America and how important your institution finds this. How do you fit this type of mobility into your institutional strategy for internationalization? Obviously, you're not just interested in regional integration, you're interested in certainly excellence in education and research. How do you fit regional mobility and regional integration into your overall institutional strategy? And how do you balance this? What are some of the challenges that you face as an institution to promote regional mobility that is not towards Europe, towards the US, towards countries that Brazil traditionally might exchange with more in the academic sector?
So Julio mentioned a very important point. In many countries in Latin America, higher education is free. It's the case in Brazil, at least for federal public universities. So my university is totally free of charge. We don't even have any ways to earn money with our students or with our academic activity. It's impossible by law in Brazil. So really, our intent with internationalization is almost exclusively focused on increasing the diversity of the point of view of the cultures to enrich teaching, research, and outreach, and also excellency. It's very clearly stated in our strategic plan. We aim at using internationalization to increase the quality of our programs. And as you hinted, Elizabeth, for our university, student mobility is a part of this excellency process to improve our university. So we really aim at sending our students and receiving students from partnering universities which have been identified as having a history with us, as doing joint research, as collaborating in terms of cultural activities. And again, I have to mention once more AUREM as a perfect example of an association where 40 more universities have together learned to know each other and developed joint actions covering the whole range of academic activities. With Julio Tyler's university, UNL, it's far more than just exchanging one student from time to time. We have organized conferences together, exposition of videos, even some on technology and innovation. We have signed the first double degree agreement at undergraduate level, which as far as we know exists in Latin America. So really work on quality, which is also an answer to your second question. Of course, it's a challenge to promote intra-regional mobility in our university. Many of our youth want to go to Europe, want to go to North America. But when we offer to them an opportunity to have a high quality experience in a different country, and for a Brazilian, a different country in Latin America means also a different language. We speak Portuguese here, not Spanish. So we are also able to motivate student mobility in neighboring countries based on the quality of the experience that we are sure that we offer to our students. It's been very clear these last weeks during the COVID pandemic. We have students from Universidad Nacional del Litoral here in Porto Alegre at UFRGS. Some of them decided to go back to Argentina because there's no way to study right now at UFRGS. First, they could go back to Argentina because you have road connections between my state and Argentina. So it was a safety criteria for those students. So it's good for those students from Argentina to be here in Porto Alegre because they had physically a way to go back to their countries when they wanted, which is not the case had they been in mobility in Europe, for instance. Second, those students who wanted to go back home told us, we want to go back to Porto Alegre next semester because they discovered the quality of the university, the quality of the courses here, and they're convinced that they'll have great experience here. So there is a challenge to develop this intra-regional mobility, but we have also some assets in terms of quality, in terms of proximity, in terms of cultural proximity among our universities, which could help us improving and increasing those mobility flows.
Okay, thank you, Nico, and I think your comment is in line with also some of the questions that are coming in. We had one question, for example, where they said, based on what was said by Julio and Luisa related to the PILA program, how can we integrate Latin American universities when we are strongly affected by COVID-19 and we've had to cancel activities related to academic mobility of students, teachers, and researchers? I would like to come back to that question again at the end, because I would like every panelist to weigh on that, but we know that's in everybody's minds right now. Before doing that, I would like to go to Romina. I would like to ask Romina a similar question that I asked Nicolas Maillard regarding how your institution weighs different types of mobility strategically. Obviously, there's an interest in regional mobility in Europe. There are tremendous funding mechanisms and incentives, but you also spoke about international programs, cooperation for development, mobility in a wider sense, joint degree programs and things like this. How do you balance this all strategically? How has your institution done that? And where do you think regional integration and objectives fit in that strategic profile?
Okay, as I explained at the beginning, the University of Bologna has a diversified strategy that embraces not only Europe with the Erasmus Plus program for study, but also different geographical areas where the delegates of the rector has been appointed and work jointly with us with the IRO. As I mentioned before, with like IRO, we are divided in geographical areas. We have a big unit that is Europe. Then we have a unit for Eastern neighboring countries, Russia, Asia, Oceania, North America. And then the third one is Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Western Balkan units. That is the unit where I'm appointed as a deputy coordinator. So what does each unit do at the international office? We deal with mobility at all levels. with different programs, as you say, with EU programs, national programs, or programs funded by the University of Bologna. We also deal with agreements with partners, with bilateral agreements, also with the networks that implies with that regions. We have mobility schemes that we deal with the different programs that we are funds, and also the international programs that I mentioned before. In the case of Europe, there is also Jean Monnet, Strategic Alliance, etc. So how does this work? How we deal with the strategic of the University of Bologna and all these geographical areas? Sometimes it's a partner that contacts us with a proposal to work with. So we at the IO try to appoint the best professor that can work in that field, or sometimes it's the professor that have an idea to work with another colleague from one geographical area, and we try to find the most suitable program to develop his idea and to work it out. For example, as you first mentioned, the Intra-Africa, I mentioned before that we have an Intra-Africa, we won last year, and this was one example of how a professor was in contact with another professor, and this idea came to the International Relations Office, and we helped to make the proposal. For example, with 107, the International Credit Mobility, we work in both sides with the at institutional level with our delegate or geographical area, we also with the delegate from the department. So we try to meet the strategic of the University of Bologna with the needs and the fields of research for the academic community. So we try to do that job. For example, I just wanted to do some examples of how we deal the collaboration, the mobility, and the different programs with the different regions that we have right now in this webinar. With Latin America, we can see from the beginning, we began with bilateral agreements with mobility schemes for staff and students. Then with Bardon, the mobility with the schemes with Erasmus Mundus Action 2, and currently with the capacity building, as you said, Elizabeth, that makes to help the cooperation with the partners, also with the capacity buildings. With South Africa, it was different. I think we started more with Erasmus Mundus Action 2 to cooperate, and then that brings to set bilateral agreement that were included in our destination, in our mobility program overseas outside Europe. And the mobility screen was reinforced also with the ICM, the International Credit Mobility, and also with the capacity building. And with Africa, it was another strategy, because first it was at departmental level that they had the idea to collaborate with another professor, that they bring it to the International Relations Office, and we started like this with national funds from the national agency, the Italian National Agency for Development. Then we had the opportunity to work in these intra-Africa academic mobility schemes. So as you see, it depends on how the proposal arises and how the funds we get or we have to also deal with the different proposals.
Okay, thanks, Romina. That's really interesting. I mean, I think it shows that this process of defining mobility objectives is certainly not something that just comes from the top. It can be guided from the top. It needs structures, but it also needs to respond to departmental interests, individual researcher interests. It takes having a structure like your office and like the rector's delegates for international relations to connect the dots sometimes, to say we have this interesting funding tool and this department interested in researching this, and maybe we can upscale this and generate more mobility, while at the same time opening the door to research in, you know, in malarial treatments or what have you. So I think that's an interesting example of some of the institutional dynamics at play. I think it's also really important to mention again that we've been quite lucky in Europe. We have a lot of different funding instruments at our disposal. Some of them are nationally funded. Many of them are European, EU funded. You mentioned yet again the Intra-Africa Mobility Program that your university is participating in. So it's a program for mobility within Africa, but the EU universities support, provide lessons, provide some mentoring or what have you. So we're lucky in Europe. We have these tools. We have more tools potentially than other regions, but I think it's up to every institution to navigate the funding tools and the cooperation tools at their disposal and match them with the interests of their academic community, whether it be from the top level or from the bottom level up. I wanted to come back to Ursula before addressing some of the questions in the chat. Still on that line of thinking, the DAD is an organization that is present all over the globe, funding mobility, as you outlined, funding development cooperation programs. What's your perspective on this, what we say in development cooperation, this north-south-south dynamic? So facilitating collaboration between the quote-unquote North, Europe, and developing regions and countries such as Africa, such as Latin America. Again, sometimes I think this vocabulary is outdated and inappropriate, but we still use it. And I think what we're trying to get at is this multilateral dimension in which we increasingly need to collaborate, which clearly is a priority for the DAD, evidenced through the programs that you support. How do you think this is playing out? And more importantly, how do you see the balance between development cooperation agendas and university internationalization agendas in your various programs?
I think I will start with the balance between development cooperation and internationalization. This is quite an interesting point, and we're doing a little research at this quite at the moment. Because what we see is that often inside universities you have an internationalization strategy, which inside German universities to be precise, which does not include development cooperation, and then some universities also have strategies on development cooperation. But those things are not necessarily combined or intertwined, but what you can see is that internationalization, including inbound and outbound mobility for German universities, is quite something different from development cooperation. And if you see what the top 10 countries were, or the top 20 countries, I looked at the top 20 where German outbound students go to when they are mobile during their studies, you have almost no developing country on it. You have Austria on number 1 because they speak German there, so it's not so difficult. You have obviously the UK at place 3, you have the US at number 5, and you have China at 6, but then you have Turkey, Canada as non-European countries between the top 20, so that you can see that individual mobility from if you look at the German students has almost nothing to do with development cooperation or with going to the global south in a way. On the other hand, you see that German universities are interested in cooperating with universities from the global south and with fostering multilateral cooperation. So I think that we are in a way overcoming the idea of North and South and thinking more in a network metaphor in a way, creating global networks between universities. And so what the DAD tries to do is, on the one hand, to support students wherever they want to go. On the other hand, to put a strong focus on project funding and on multilateral project funding, enabling those global networks to grow. So that in the long run, hopefully, cooperations that include universities from the global south, but also from the north, so those multilateral cooperations will become one way of sharpening the international profile of universities.
Okay,
that's
thank
what
you.
I'd like to point out on this.
Okay, excellent, Ursula. Thank you so much. Totally concur. I think you've come to the motivation for this webinar, really. And I think we need to see many of the DAD programs in light of that objective. It's going to become even more pressing. It's the objective of Obriel Global, helping to generate and consolidate these networks. In the run up to this webinar, we've had some important dialogue meetings between Sarua and Awihime, or Grupo Montevideo group of universities that Nicolas Maillard spoke about, trying to flesh out some common priorities. We've been collecting data on the extent to which member universities in Awihime in the Mercosur are collaborating with universities in Africa, either through research publications or mobility or through MOUs. So trying to create a picture of what exists and also trying to consolidate channels for cooperation, whether they be through EU projects, whether they be through with the support of European partners or partners identified in the different regions. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. I would like to now take a few questions from the question and answer that came in, and to finish on the issue of COVID as a game changer. So again, I'm going to put these questions to all the panelists. Not everyone has to reply. It's up to you if you want to weigh in. The first question was addressed specifically towards Sarua, but I think the question is relevant for everybody. And it has to do with incentivizing mobility within the region, mobility to your neighbors. And the question is, can this somehow be a performance indicator in the way we evaluate internationalizations? If we think that regional integration and mobility is so critical, or if we think that mobility to other partners in the world, to non-traditional destinations like between Africa and Latin America, is important for our development objectives, how can we better incentivize it, and how can we better monitor it? And the question specifically referred to, can we establish some performance indicators within the institution's own internationalization plans? Would anybody like to comment? The question was for Sarua, but anyone is welcome to comment on that. Who would like to jump in?
Because it was addressed to Sarua, just a short on this. Most institutions are quite autonomous, and to build it in as a performance indicator would probably be quite difficult. The only way that we could do it is when the ministers of SADC meet. They do have the powers to actually announce indicators like this. For instance, the 5% mobility indicator was agreed by all the ministers. But I think one should use the carrot and the stick to enhance interregional mobility. 90% of the problem is funding. I'm very I'm happy that the colleagues have mentioned the intra-ACTP mobility that's funded by Europe. But if you look at it, it is not that popular amongst students because they still prefer mobility to the north. I think we need to change the narrative around why is intra-regional mobility as important as other mobilities. And, you know, I think we can come to the COVID issue, and I just want to link it to it. I do believe this period is going to give us a whole an opportunity to think new, to really be innovative around internationalization. I don't want to belabor this point, but there's not going to be that many planes flying anymore. And the financial impact of COVID to the developing countries, the economist that published a week ago, there's only a few countries that's actually going to have enough money to do all the things we did before. So my own view is that there would be inter-regional collaboration would probably now get much more attention from those that play in the space and that wants to develop global and international citizens.
Okay, thank you. Nico, would anybody else like to comment on that issue? No, okay. I had one question that came as well in from the organization Universities Caribbean, based in the Caribbean, bringing together different Caribbean island states and universities in Caribbean border countries. And the question was, is the Caribbean part of Latin America? Should we share the same regional integration and mobility goals? And what possibilities are there to enhance that relationship, to enhance the Caribbean role in the Latin American and Caribbean regional space? And this would be a question specifically to our Latin American colleagues.
El proceso de integración siempre considera al Caribe como parte sustancial del proceso de integración. Lo que no hemos logrado hasta ahora es relacionar la Asociación del Caribe de Universidades a estos procesos, pero claro que estamos 100% abiertos a promover la integración. Yo quería aprovechar a decir algo, Elizabeth. Si hay algo que el COVID-19 va a dejar como resultado, es la valoración de la virtualidad en la educación superior. De hecho, el programa PILA está pensando abrir un apéndice que sea la movilidad virtual de estudiantes para el próximo semestre, teniendo en cuenta la imposibilidad de hacer movilidad presencial. Y esto abre una gran posibilidad de utilizar la virtualidad en la internacionalización, no solo haciendo webinarios o reuniones de trabajo, sino utilizando la virtualidad para la internacionalización integral, para la internacionalización del currículum. Por ejemplo, en los acuerdos de doble titulación, que hoy en general requieren que el estudiante se traslade un 30 o 40% del tiempo a la otra universidad, la virtualidad puede ayudar muchísimo a promover una cooperación más intensa en la cooperación académica en el doble título, por ejemplo. Creo que es un resultado potencial del problema del COVID-19.
Thank you, Julio. Actually, that transitions to the next question I was going to ask, which was raised several times in the question and answer section. Your first comment was that the Caribbean has always been foreseen politically as part of the higher education space, and now with developments with, for example, Enlaces, which is the Latin American and Caribbean regional higher education space, that's consolidated more. However, that hasn't necessarily translated to the active level of exchange that could be desired, particularly between the Caribbean and certain Southern American countries. You then commented on the tremendous potential now and also the need to explore the concept of virtual mobility. This was a question put out by our colleagues in SUCA, the Central American Regional University Association, another important member and partner of OBREAL, but another important association in the Latin American landscape, where the question was really, how can we work with this concept of virtual mobility? How can we really put it into practice and make it valuable, given that we have tremendous challenges now with regards to physical mobility, particularly in the immediate? It's something that has been on the agenda for some years. Some universities have developed some interesting practices with regards to virtual mobility, what it really means, what it really is, but it's not yet something that I think is fully understood or implemented. Julio mentioned the possibility to realize double degrees to a larger extent through virtual mobility, double degrees which are sometimes quite difficult to implement within Latin America and also sometimes difficult to legislate around, whereby virtual mobility components might facilitate that. So in that respect, I would like to ask the rest of the panel to comment on this issue. COVID-19 has changed the game. We maintain our regional integration objectives and ambitions. We all believe it's still important to facilitate physical mobility, but we are now being forced to consider different options, including virtual mobility arrangements. What are some of the solutions or the ways of confronting COVID that are being discussed in your organizations and your institutions, particularly when it comes to internationalization and mobility? What do you think the risks are to solutions like virtual mobility, and what are the potential advantages as well to exploring this more actively now that we're forced to? So again, this question is to all panelists. Who would like to start?
I would like to start because I would like to complement the information of PILA that Julio said. And I think that in case of PILA program, COVID-19 has generated several difficulties. Of course, we need to change our planning for the second semester. We have many suspension of mobilities and serious inconveniences to the return to the students for other countries. And indeed, physical or face-to-face mobility, of course, will decrease. But in order to maintain activities, I think that PILA virtual or programs like COIL or mobility, virtual mobility, of course, they don't intend to replace the traditional PILA, but to complement it is very special in this situation. And I would like to have a pilot, and according to the results, we need to see if it's possible to continue in the future with this idea. And I think that we need to take advantage of the strategies and the tools, virtual tools in that moment. And it's better because we don't need in many resources, and it is possible to focus on our goals and to strengthen ties of cooperation with the Caribbean, the region, and with other association and networks. And I think that is a good way to start with this step. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luisa. Excellent. And I think it would be very welcome if PILA would pilot a virtual mobility component, because we're very eager to see how that could be put into practice as a complementary element of the existing program. I have Alexandre who would like to comment on this issue. Alexandre.
Thank you, Elizabeth. For East African community, we have got many students who went back home from different countries, and we are working towards the development of a platform for e-learning. And we would like to explore the development of electronic assessment application that could help us do in-depth assessment of trainings. I wanted just to mention also that what I said here, I focused only on Inter-University Council for East Africa initiatives, but we have Reform that promotes mobility in agriculture. We have ICIPE using PASSET and World Bank financing and partner states financing for PhD scholarships. We have a Carnegie Africa Diaspora Fellowship Program promoting mobility with diaspora and back home. And we have also the World Academy of Science in Africa that promotes also mobility through summer schools in the region. So there are many initiatives on the continent, but here I focus mainly on what is being done by Inter-University Council for East Africa. I thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for also for pointing to those other initiatives. It shows how rich the landscape is. Very interesting that you're moving towards exploring online assessment, and that you're also pushing forward in e-learning platforms for the council. Would anybody like to come back to this issue now of virtual mobility? Yes, Romina.
Yes, maybe I can explain the example of the University of Bologna. So far, the COVID-19 had a dramatic impact on mobility and leaves an uncertain next term because we don't know how it's going to be developed. Mobility always currently plays, let's say, a major role with the approach to international education, and in Europe and as well, it's open the idea to virtual mobility, but I don't think that we are all ready to do virtual mobility, because what we are doing right now is lessons online, but lessons online is not the same that having the student having a virtual mobility, he's attended the lessons online. So I think that we had to wait a little bit to all the institutions adapt to this new situation and to see how they are going to cope with the COVID-19. Because if you ask our students what they think, they prefer to postpone their mobility and not to do that online. So this semester, they decided to postpone the mobility to the next semester, with the hope they are going finally do their mobility physically and not online. So I think that we as universities, we have this idea in the agenda for virtual mobility, but it's not the same for the student. There's one possibility in their career life. So they prefer, I think, in my opinion, they prefer to do it physically. We will see next year, we will have to take into account that to recover for SARS, it took 2 years. And we don't know right now how it's going to take to recover from the COVID-19.
Thank you, Romina, and thank you for reminding us that we have to go one step at a time. And also coming back to Alexandra said, we need to have the tools, virtual and otherwise, to make it possible, but the students also have to get on board with this agenda, and they might have other priorities. Ramon, you had a comment.
Yes, but it's too late. I think we have to leave it for the next webinar. My only point is that most of the points we have been discussing existed well before the COVID-19 crisis. The points raised by Ursula, for example, all were there. The problem is that we were not aware that the situation had changed. And maybe the great advantage of COVID-19 is simply to make us aware that we cannot go with university activity as we were in the 18th century. Things have changed. And probably it doesn't make sense that a student in a university which is not the best of the world in the South goes north to go to another university that continues to be not the best in the world, when maybe what should do these two universities is to come together with maybe one of the best universities in the world in putting something together, modular courses, and maybe we, or maybe you, because I'm retired, university lecturers should rethink what the hell is our job and what should we be doing, and not continuing to teach as if we were in the 19th century. But this is food for the next webinar, in which I think we should address all these issues, because now we are already 2 hours and a minute, and we are a minute late for you, Elizabeth, to close it and open the way to the next webinars in the series.
Okay, thank you so much, Ramon. I am aware that we have now gone over the time. I think those are some excellent concluding words. We didn't get to any last words that Nicolas, Maillard, or Ursula might have. Is there anything burning you would like to add? Ramon has summed it up as he tends to do very well. So with that, I would like to thank all of the panelists for being with us today, coming from very different parts of the world. Thank you, Romina, and our hearts are with all of the Italians now in your period of recovery. Thanks so much to Alexandre joining us from East Africa, Nico from Sorua, Julio in Argentina, Luisa in Colombia, Nicolas in Brazil, Ursula in Bonn, I believe, and Ramon in Barcelona. Our next webinar will be on June 3rd. You will soon receive an announcement for that. We will look at the topic of internationalizing the curricula through possible approaches to modularization and also modularizing online delivery. We'll be drawing upon some interesting projects. We'll be hearing from other interesting networks, organizations, and strategic partners of Obrial Global. We'll have some input from India, a region we didn't hear from today. So please stay tuned for that. You will receive the recording of this webinar. You will also receive the presentations, and we will ask our panelists to provide some resources and links to initiatives they might have mentioned, which we think might be of common interest. So on that note, I would just like to thank you all. I think that, and Alexandre wrote, can we overcome language? I think it's a very good question. Indeed, I mean, at least for the future of webinars, we have to address the language issue if we're going to really take forward this multi-regional collaboration. And we hope that Obrial Global can be the guinea pigs and potentially offer a next webinar with some interpretation. We know that Zoom allows for it, so we will try it. So thank you so much to everyone. And please stay safe, stay healthy, continue all your excellent work, and we look forward to seeing you again, whether it be online or physically in the near future. Thank you to everyone, and thank you to the participants. Have a lovely evening or afternoon.